Hello, everyone. This week we are talking about equity-centered trauma-informed education. Since it was a book everyone chose to learn more about. And so I've actually been reading this book in my own time and I love it. And I picked out a few things that I really want to talk about. So enough chitter chatter, I'll just get started. So just an overview, I just want to touch on equity and trauma-informed education, ACEs and their limitations, talk about universal design learning or UDL and how that can work in a trauma-informed education framework. And then lastly, we are going to switch into things that we can do as educators and talk about the 4 proactive priorities for decision making. So before getting into this topic, I want to, there's a lot of information out there on what is trauma-informed education. And so I figure first, before we dive deeper into the topic, let's just talk about some basics on trauma and kind of talk about what it is and what it isn't, just to clear some things up. So trauma can be both an individual or collective response to life-threatening events, harmful conditions, or prolonged dangerous or stressful environment. And so a keyword for this point would be collective. So there can be a lot of different types of trauma. And so it's not just an individual thing when something crazy happens. It can be a lot of different things and or one thing to happening to one person or a group of people to cause trauma. Another thing is not all stressful experiences become trauma or have traumatized an individual. So, you know, a lot of things can be stressful in life. And we'll even talk a little bit further with the ACE study, but you can experience potentially traumatic events in life and still not be traumatized. Or on the flip side, somebody can experience maybe something that wouldn't be traumatic for other people, but in their certain case or scenario, it was traumatic to them and they do develop a trauma response. For those that, For those that develop a trauma response, the effects can be very intense, very pervasive, disruptive, and it affects both the body and the mind. So there are psychological and emotional things that the person can experience from trauma, but there also are physiological aspects or physiological symptoms that the person may experience. And so just keeping that in mind, it's not just, you know, in your head, right? These are actual symptoms that people are experiencing, just like, you know, if somebody were to break their leg, right? They have a physical trauma on their body in the same way that stressful events and situations can cause a trauma to our well-being and to the psychological aspect. And then it can show physiologically as well. And so many types of events can cause trauma, such as abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, bullying, harassment, racism, natural disasters, war, and more. Again, we will talk about the ACE study later, but there are a lot of things not included in that study that cause trauma as well, including, you know, racial trauma, generational trauma, I got a little mixed up, including, you know, especially I would like to point out war. I know there's been things such as like instances of historical traumas, such as the Holocaust, where it caused trauma to a whole group and generation. But there are things happening today, like war scenarios, especially when we go and teach in our schools with a lot of refugees. They have also experienced, it's likely that they have experienced traumatic events as well. And so I wanted to include war just so we know that it's not something in the past, or it's not something that soldiers get. Only soldiers get when they return home, and they have PTSD. A lot of students in our schools have experienced very similar situations in their home countries, and then they immigrate here. And so that's another thing to be aware of too. And then also I included generational trauma. So especially looking at certain groups, such as Holocaust survivors, and then the way that impacts them and then their children and families moving forward, in the same way that racial trauma kind of intersects with generational trauma, in the way that there are systems of oppression, and these oppressive forces are traumatizing people through generations, and it's causing a lot of traumatic experiences moving down the line. And so I just wanted to include all of that as well, just so we're aware that it's not an individual thing. It can happen to groups of people, families, generations, a lot of people. There's more facts about trauma. And then also trauma can be understood as an ongoing experience. So it's not just a singular event that would cause trauma, especially in cases of abuse and neglect. It's usually a lot of, I don't want to say little things, but a lot of various things that are happening in that student's life that, you know, would cause just an overwhelming sense of trauma. And especially things like poverty, again, and you know, students that are refugees escaping, you know, war situations at home. A lot of different ways that trauma can be an ongoing experience, not just solely in a one-time traumatic event. And so when we talk about potentially traumatic events, it's important to know that it's called potentially traumatic because not every traumatic event will actually cause trauma. And so anybody can experience this trauma, but not everybody will be traumatized or develop a trauma response. It's actually estimated that a half to a third of all people under the age of 18 will experience one of these potentially traumatic events before they're 18. But a lot of things can be done, or a lot of protective factors are in place or could be in place to protect that child from trauma. I don't remember where this quote is from, but I remember hearing someone speak about how there's buffers to trauma, and how not everybody will experience trauma. And it's not exactly about, they said it's not exactly about what happened to you, but it's about, were you alone when that thing happened? And so was that child or was that student meant to deal with that, left to deal with that event alone? Or did they have protective factors in place, like a strong community support system, or really strong relationships with reliable adults or caregivers? Did they have, you know, were they able to handle the stress of the event? Maybe alone, but most likely, you know, from other people, a sense of community. And so going into education, these are things to consider because we want to be able to kind of provide those buffers, and not alone, but we'll talk about that later. And so talking about the symptoms of trauma, a lot of the trauma-informed education research focuses on, you know, challenging behaviors and what to do when you notice these challenging behaviors. And I don't want to focus too much on the behaviors, but it is good to know, just so you can be able to recognize maybe what these trauma responses look like. And so a lot of these things affecting the mind and body can cause depression, anxiety, anger, aggression, hypervigilance, which is, you know, being jumpy or maybe a student is like easily scared, things like that. Physiological changes such as disrupted sleep, appetite, and I mean, trauma can even affect the nervous system. And so, I mean, I'm not in the medical field, but I do know that it does affect the nervous system. And so that's how we get into how it disrupts sleep and things like that. And so there's a multitude of physiological changes, but a lot of this will present student behavior. It's important to note that when we see these quote unquote challenging behaviors, we want to have a positive regard towards them and understand that it's not a deficit of the student. It is not, you know, it's not something negative about that student. Rather, it's just something we can see and notice, so that we can care for them and know that, you know, these behaviors are almost like a call for help rather than, you know, them being bad kids, right? There's no such thing as bad children. And so now that we know a little bit more about, you know, trauma, what it looks like, you know, I'm losing the word, but, you know, things that maybe we heard, but they're not very true about trauma. We're a little bit more educated on the topic now. And so let's talk about, you know, some of the shifts that we want to make, from, you know, what we used to understand and a lot of misconceptions about trauma informed education versus where we actually want to be at when we're talking about being trauma informed educators. And so when I'm talking about challenging behaviors, so that's very individual, right? It's very, oh, student A has, you know, is very aggressive, refuses to do work, very defiant, whatever you want to, you know, label the student as. Instead of, you know, taking that and saying, okay, well, we can do these strategies to help that particular student. Rather, instead of that individual approach where that student is labeled and that student is, you know, kind of differentiated from the rest of their class, we want to take a more systematic approach. And so instead of focusing so much on the behaviors and our knowledge of trauma and trying to help individual students, we actually want to move towards a whole systematic approach to trauma informed education. And another reason I say this is because, well, and I don't just say this, obviously, this is from the book, but another reason why we want to switch to a more systematic approach is because current trauma informed education in practice in schools, often you'll see either teachers taking that, you know, behavior, you know, multi-tiered system of support or PBIS approach where, oh, this student has challenging behaviors, here are the interventions we'll do to help said student. That's kind of a individual approach in the classroom. And then you have the flip side where people will say, oh yes, we're a trauma-informed school, you know, an admin will be informed on the trauma and kind of end it there. And so what we really need is a whole system, right? Of, you know, you have your admin, you have your support specialists, and then you have your classroom teachers, and you have your community. And in this system, we are able to, you know, more accurately help all students rather than just picking individual students that we feel may have trauma. And that's another thing, I didn't write it on my slides, but going back to the basics of trauma, another reason why the individualistic approach isn't always successful either is that there are a lot of students who slip through the cracks, not only by just looking at the ACE study where they don't include a lot of factors like you know, racism and equity, oppression, stuff like that, but a lot of students who experience trauma, it's not always your, you know, aggressive, loud student that's always a problem kid, sometimes it's your student who overachieves, and is very quiet because maybe they're scared of getting in trouble, because they get in trouble a lot at home and they're abused at home. And even, I was listening to the audiobook of the author Alex Shirvren Vinay. She talked about how she actually, in her own struggle with her childhood trauma, she poured herself into work and school, and she used school as a way to forget about her difficulties at home. And so, again, that's why we don't want to do an individual approach to trauma informed education, because there are so many students who could slip through the cracks because they're not out there, right? And they're not your problem kids, the ones that are like, hi, look at me, give me attention. Right? And so that's another reason why we want to switch to more of a systematic approach. So also another switch that we want to change is thinking about the origin of trauma, and how this idea that students experience trauma outside of schools and then they present behaviors and issues inside of schools, or issues like the students are an issue. They're not, but there's a prevalent idea that all of these adverse childhood experiences or trauma, all of that happens outside of schools, and inside schools we're perfect, right? And that's not the case at all, which actually comes to my third point, addressing the impact of trauma without naming the cause. Another issue with trauma-informed education currently is that a lot of people will talk about, oh, we're going to solve trauma and help all the kids and it's all going to be great. And then they don't name the causes of trauma. And so thinking about where trauma comes from, it's not only outside of schools, but trauma occurs quite often inside schools. And we actually have re-traumatization inside schools. And so moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to elaborate on that later, but that's another switch we have to make, is understanding that kids are being traumatized in our schools. And we'll talk about ways to not do that. And so another switch to make would be to recognize trauma not as a label. And so part of that would be doing away from a study checklist, and quit, ceasing to label students as, oh, you're a trauma kid, you're not a trauma kid. So, we'll help the trauma kids and the rest of the kids, oh, you're fine, right? Again, a think wide system, helping everyone and giving everybody the tools that they need, whether they have experienced trauma or not. And so we're not labeling students with trauma. And so our last point, and probably the most important point underneath all of this, is that equity and trauma-informed education must go hand in hand. We can't have trauma-informed education without talking about equity, because things that are against equity, like racism, oppression, all forms of, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, all of that causes trauma. And so we can't be working against trauma and healing, attempting to heal students and help them, grow into better versions of themselves, without addressing equity and without naming the things that cause trauma, which would be oppression and racism and all of that bad stuff. And so that's the main point of our book that we're talking about today. And so talking about these switches that we're making from, what trauma-informed education is in the mainstream and, what's currently being practiced right now, and misinformation out there. And we're switching to a more just a better version of trauma-informed education with equity involved. Let's talk about a new definition. And so I just took the definition straight from the reading, but trauma-informed educational practices respond to the impacts of trauma on the entire school community and prevent future trauma from occurring. Equity and social justice are key concerns of trauma-informed educators as we make changes to our individual practice in classrooms, in schools, and in district-wide and statewide systems. Okay, that was a mouthful. And so I'll kind of point out a few brief takeaways from this. And so when we're talking about systematic, I mean, yeah, everything's systematic, blah, blah, blah. That's like a buzzword right now. But what we mean by that is that it's not only the trauma kids or the students who have experienced trauma. It's not only those kids that need help, but a lot of these practices are great for everybody. Studies shown, we'll talk about that in the 4 proactive priorities. But also when we talk about preventing future trauma from occurring, that's when we talk about having our buffers in place. Because if I'm a 3rd grade teacher and I'm practicing trauma-informed education, part of that trauma-informed education would be to create community and have empowerment in my classroom. And so even if those are meant to help kids with trauma, it also is helping and benefiting the rest of the class because we are creating those buffers. So that way, if those students after 3rd grade are experiencing very difficult times and potentially traumatic events, hopefully those buffers can help shield them from that, potentially traumatic event. And so that's the main takeaway from that first part of the definition. And so talking about equity and social justice, they are key concerns of trauma-informed educators because, again, we cannot have trauma-informed education and be working against these systematic oppressive forces that cause trauma without addressing equity. And so these ideas of equity are going to be at the forefront when we're making changes in our individual practice in classrooms and so on. And so that's some of the key takeaways that I enjoy from this definition because it's pointing out a lot of the, not so great things about current practice in trauma-informed education, but and it's, including the things that we need to improve upon it. So right here, I put a lot of the principles of equity-centered trauma-informed education. And so number 1, clearly anti-racist, anti-oppressive, for a reason. I mean, I won't waste my breath here. It's so important, guys, and I've already kind of discussed it. Asset-based. And so we talk a lot about the deficit model versus the asset-based model. And so we're not looking at these kids for what deficits they have or what has happened to them, but we need to focus on where are we at with these students? What assets do these students have now that we can build upon rather than focusing on their deficits? System number 3, systems orientated. So that is, again, steering away from any kind of individual practice in trauma-informed education and moving more towards a holistic approach to trauma-informed education. Human-centered, and by that we mean we're looking at the person, we're looking at who that student is as a human and not just as a student, as a kid, as someone I'm in charge of, but looking at them as a whole person for their strengths, weaknesses, everything. And we're focused on our shared humanity, right? And so the way I kind of look at this, when I have to make decisions, whenever I'm in a teaching setting is, well, what would younger Brittany want? Or, you know, if I were that student, what would I need in that moment, right? Because you can be the authority figure or the teacher in charge and whatnot. And okay, well, what would be most responsible? What would be, you know, doing my job the most? Or you can look at what do they need as a person, right? They're not just robots that do their work and turn it in and right, like no, but none of us are. And so taking that human-centered approach to teaching is at the forefront here. Number 5, universal and proactive. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I won't waste my breath here. And then 6, again, social justice focused, which again, we'll cover that enough in this lecture. Okay, and so one of the key things that I was interested in is looking at the in-school trauma producing factors, or ways that schools produce trauma and re-traumatize students. Because I mean, we all are, you know, it's been heavily looked at the ways that students can experience trauma outside of schools, but I think rather we also need to look inward and look at the ways that, you know, our schools and our teachers are continuing to traumatize students. And so the 3 ones that she talked about in the book are bullying and harassment, police and zero tolerance policies, and curriculum violence and racial trauma. First, bullying and harassment. And so I think first thought, you know, it's not, everybody kind of knows what bullying is. We've seen it in our schools, but a lot of the time the regard to bullying is just, oh, well, that's normal. That's kids being kids. But it's harmful. The effects are big. They lead to anxiety, depression, PTSD. And also it's that not all kids are targeted equally, and that specific groups of kids are heavily targeted in our schools. And that would be LGBT youth, students of color, lower income students, and students with disabilities are at a higher risk of being targets of bullying. And so when people say, oh, well, that's just kids being kids, you know, that's normal. What is most concerning about that is that, one, it's not normal, and it's not just about relational conflict, but it's about power over others. And so when we talk about power dynamics, we must talk about, you know, where, you know, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and oppression, classism, where that actually comes into play in these power dynamics. And so the point is that bullying and harassment that thrives at schools where we are not addressing these issues and where we're not addressing discrimination. And so by addressing these, you know, issues and this discrimination and power dynamics, we can create validating communities and hopefully create inclusive spaces for these students as well, other than just addressing it. And so that's all I have to say on bullying and harassment. Next, we have police and zero tolerance policies. I know we've talked about this in class before, where we talk about SROs and police presence in schools. And so briefly, I would just like to say that having police in schools, it can be a reminder of collective trauma for a lot of students, especially students of color. They can feel threatened by these police in schools. And by having zero tolerance policies, it only furthers the school to prison pipeline, because when we have no regard for context or any kind of rationale for the student misbehavior, we are pretty much disregarding any of that and sending them right to some kind of disciplinary action. And so for creating that system of sending kids ultimately to prison, um, in a way. And so I won't talk about that too much just because I know we did talk about it in class, but just know that having this police presence in schools, it escalates situations most often, and they disproportionately harm students of color, especially when just the reminder of them and just having them there can be a reminder of traumatic events or just generational trauma and past experience with police. And lastly, curriculum violence and racism. So, curriculum violence is the result of classroom content and pedagogy that harms students intellectually and emotionally. Most of these examples are formed in some sort of in-class reenactments, or a lot of it is called experiential education, where teachers will plan lessons um, in a very insensitive way to reenact things like the Holocaust, slavery, Trail of Tears. I included in this photo, it looks like the students have cotton. I'm assuming in a class regarding learning about slavery. And I mean, little things like that, it can feel little, but to students of color and marginalized students, it can be a really in your face kind of way to harm and to hurt that student. I'm sure we've all heard about or in person heard the use of racial slurs in lessons, whether they're, in books. I've had history teachers pretend to be a character from the past and use the N-word. I was uncomfortable, so I couldn't imagine, a student of color being in that classroom and how they must have felt. And so the use of racial slurs, digital racial trauma, such as images from social media, like blackface and racial violence, especially videos maybe of police brutality, that can be really hard for students to see. And so that could bring up all of these emotions. And then how is that student supposed to learn after witnessing such a terrible reminder of, their own trauma? And so, and then obviously physical violence related to racial trauma, kind of like what I was talking, kind of related to zero tolerance policies, where I've heard of, fights breaking out because, a student has said a racial slur to another student, and then a fight happens. And with zero tolerance, there is no context, for why the fight even happened when there is an act of racial violence that had occurred. And so, I don't know, just something I'm thinking about, and how all these things kind of connect and can play out in our schools. And lastly, verbal intimidation and threats between students or from teachers. I went to North Star, and so it's a very diverse school, and I've heard a lot of things, and I've definitely heard verbal threats and intimidation from students, at least not from teachers, thank God, but at least amongst students, I've heard some pretty nasty things. And so to wrap this up, a lot of, these class reenactments are well-meaning, or they just really want their students to, feel how they felt in the past, or, just for in the name of education. But I found this quote to be really important, because I'll just read the quote. Intentionality is not a prerequisite for harmful teaching. intentionality is also not a prerequisite for racism. So by that, it's like, yeah, maybe you were well-meaning, maybe you really did want your students to learn, but it doesn't matter because it's still harmful and it's still racist. Even if we don't mean to be, the act itself is still racist and it's still harmful to your students. And so that's why I think learning about all of these things is so important, because it's very possible that you just simply don't know. And you don't know if you are being harmful, and maybe you were well-meaning. And so just learning more about these topics, we can kind of avoid those situations in the future. Moving on. Oh yeah, talking about the ACE study. So here I included an image. The ACE study encompasses the top part of the tree. And so that's all the things that are specifically in the ACE study checklist that they asked their participants, and the things underneath are things that were not included in the ACE study, but definitely contribute to trauma. And so the ACE score and ACE study has a checklist. And so I'm sure we've all kind of heard about this or learned about it in a previous class, maybe adolescent development. I know that's when I heard of it. But it's a tally of different types of abuse and neglect and other hallmarks of rough childhood. According to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the rougher your childhood, the higher your score is likely to be and the higher your risk for later health problems, which is also a thing if you're interested in looking at. There's actually studies like the ACE study that show that when you experience traumatic events and when you have trauma, it actually does affect your health for things like heart disease, cancer, a lot of physiological effects that come about, and also addiction and a lot of stuff like that happen due to experiencing trauma, if you're interested in looking more into that. But what happens a lot of times is that, as she talks about in the book, where she'll go to conferences with, trauma-informed education being the topic of discussion, and people will say, oh yeah, in my school, we give all of our students the ACE study, and so we know everybody's ACE scores, and we know all the students' ACE scores, which, yikes, not great, because we're labeling students, and we're asking them to open up about their trauma and their really difficult experiences that they have experienced. And also, again, like I mentioned, that takes a very individual approach, whereas we need a shift to a human-centered approach. In order to shift to this approach, I just want to reiterate how exactly these practices are harmful. Even if maybe the ACE study is beneficial in, a few scenarios, it's not beneficial, and it's really not recommended for use in trauma-informed education in the classroom. Because again, we're labeling students, it reduces students to a number based on what they have experienced, which also, again, a lot of the things that are in the ACE study are not the end all be all of things that can cause trauma. It doesn't include racial trauma, historical trauma, generational trauma. It doesn't include a lot of things like oppression, LGBT issues. And so it doesn't accurately depict a person's experiences. And also, again, not every potentially traumatic event will cause trauma. So maybe a student has had a lot of the things happen, and they have a very high tally score, high ACE score, yet maybe they're not traumatized and they don't develop a trauma response because they have such great, community relations and helpful relationships in their personal life as well. And so it's just not an accurate picture of what we're dealing with. So now we're talking about all the sad, negative stuff. Let's talk about what we can do to actually help. It can be kind of sad to focus on all the problems. So, where are the solutions? And so we in the book they talk about UDL, or Universal Design Learning, which is a concept from a lot of special education, the special education field. And so taking that same concept to a universal design approach to learning can also be applied to trauma informed education. And so, from shifting from a checklist or an individual approach like the ACE study, we're going to switch to a universal approach. Um, and so, there's a lot of benefits to this. We don't need to know students' ACE scores because, again, we're trying to be universal and so preventative and holistic, a systems approach. And also, a goal is to decrease stigma about trauma, and labeling the trauma kids creates more stigma and is divisive. It differentiates them from the rest of the group, and it could be isolating for them. Um, and so, UDL is a lens for trauma informed education because all students need what we call critical wellness. And so, a lot of different scholars in field talk about critical wellness, but in the book, they talk about critical wellness as a means for focusing on each member of the community as a whole person, and centering our shared humanity and ensuring each individual's needs are met. Wellness is not individual, but a community concern. And so Tyrone C. Howard and other contributors recommend that educators develop a healthy understanding of history, political, and economic structures that have a profound impact on students' ability to learn. To do anything less is professionally irresponsible and unfair to students, and disrupts efforts for optimal student wellness. I'm just going to leave it at that because he said it perfectly. But to be more specific in what you can do besides, taking this holistic human-centered approach, here are 4 tangible things that you can do in your decision making in your classroom. And so teachers make a million decisions every single day. Decisions about, how do I group my students? How do I want this assignment done? How do I want them to complete the assignment? What means of assessment am I going to do? Right. And so in these 4 decision-making strategies, or 4 priorities in decision making, we can kind of clarify what would be best with a trauma-informed framework. And so the first thing would be, yes, here we go. The first thing would be predictability. And I know it says oh, here's a fly. I know it says predictability and flexibility, which kind of sounds kind of silly put together, but hopefully I can explain this well enough. So trauma creates a profound sense of unpredictability, just in the nature of it, where students have very little control in their lives and the things that happen to them. And so it creates a lot of disruption and inner turmoil, right? And so in this sense of unpredictability, it can be really hard for students to also experience this in their daily life. We think, schools are very predictable, except when we have different classrooms with different rules and expectations, and every teacher has things that are unacceptable and acceptable in their classroom, it can be really hard for students to, in their head, figure out, okay, what is okay and what isn't okay, just going from class to class. And so one way to minimize this is to get on the same page as the school faculty. And so one way to do this is to have very objective rules. I know that when we talked about zero tolerance policies and police in our schools, when another group did a presentation in class, we talked about how a lot of students were being um, arrested even or suspended or in general reprimanded for things that were very subjective, like their behavior, the teacher didn't find it desirable, or they were being disrespectful, which is a very subjective thing to be in trouble for. And so getting on the same page as a school faculty and deciding what are the expectations for everyone in each class, so that way it makes school a little bit more predictable, and so students aren't thinking they're doing the right thing and then somehow upsetting and their teacher and getting in trouble. And so one way that UDL can be helpful in this as well is UDL can be designed or used to make school very, very predictable for students because it's all standard, it's all universal. And so on the flip side of that, students also need flexibility. And by flexibility, mainly we're talking about flexibility in their, in their curriculum, but also flexibility in, what they need as a person in the moment, right? And so since trauma affects everyone differently, we can't have a one size approach for rules or ways of dealing with each individual person's situation. And so we need to be sensitive to their feelings, and we can't push their feelings aside or their trauma responses aside to fit into our own, sense of rules and expectations. And so when she talked about this in the book, she was talking about how, one student, they may need a lot of time after a certain event happens, whereas another person may need just a little bit, and they may need a structure to get back to their normal after an event. So being flexible with each individual student can really help in being what would be the best trauma informed practice for them. And then the other two proactive priorities are empowerment and connection. And so true empowerment is claiming and using one's power. It's not just making someone feel good. Oh, I'm going to empower you to do this, blah, blah. It's like actually giving away some control. And so I know, and again, this can kind of go in hand with flexibility, but in general, like our students need to have some control in the classroom. When she talked about this, she talked about how she would visit schools where students, I mean, as young as like second grade, they would have to walk in very straight lines and be absolutely still and absolutely quiet and sit in their chairs nice and neat and do their work for hours on end on a computer, when that's not developmentally appropriate even to force a child to be so still and can be so controlling with those students, let alone for students who have experienced trauma and may have extra difficulty with doing that. And so empowerment means that you're flattening the imbalance power of control and you're giving some control to the students. And so just because you're the teacher, you don't have to control every aspect of, when a student goes to the bathroom, when a student needs to get a drink, when they need to take a break, when they actually want to do their work and they don't want to go play, right? Letting students kind of know what's best for them and empower them to learn what's best for them is another proactive priority. And lastly, connection. So when we're talking about buffers, connections are huge. And so what helps students heal or prevent trauma is increasing the amount of quality not only increasing the quality of their relationships, but increasing the amount of quality student relationships in general. And so, not only students with reliable adults like the buffer I'd mentioned, but also with other students and staff. This creates a community. And so, when tough experiences are happening, uh, they have a community to go to. Um, and lastly, students should build connections between themselves and the world. So, themselves in academic interests and clubs and interest based values or sports or anything that attaches them to the wider community and the wider world. Um, Bonus if it is academic, that also helps heal because it gives them something to be connected to. With that being said, I hope this was all helpful. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the assignment.